Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. Today we have Miles Kessler with us. Hi, Miles.
Hey, Mark. How's it going? Good to be with you again.
Good to see you, Uncle Miles. So Miles has got an impressive CV. He's been doing Aikido since about 1874. He's a 6th-degree Aikikai black belt. If you don't do Aikido, that's kind of a big deal. He has studied meditation for years, has done many Vipassana-style type retreats, started some peace work in the Middle East involving Aikido. I met him, first of all, in Cyprus with a project working with the UN 10 years ago, unbelievably, 11 maybe now. Yeah. And done some funky kind of online stuff as well, looking at the body, spirituality online. So from the kind of ancient to the modern, live from Tel Aviv, Miles Kessler. Hello, sir.
Hey, Mark. How you doing? How are things in Brighton today?
I'm all right. I'm happy. I've just done a second interview. It's nice to see you. I'll be going for a walk in the park with the wife after this. So
it doesn't get better than that.
I can't complain. Looking like in your dojo in Tel Aviv today.
That's right. Yeah. Cool. And first, I want to congratulate you on this new podcast.
Thank you very much.
Totally awesome. For my opinion, Mark, it's long overdue and it's much needed in the pod space.
Thank you. I like talking to interesting people, and there seemed to be a bit of a space for it. And you've seen the sort of lineup that we've got coming up that I put on Facebook yesterday. It's just people have been really generous in responding. We've got some big people on. So how did you get into working with the body? You were born in Texas, unbelievably, as I've just read from your CV.
Why is that so unbelievable?
Well, you've come a long way since Texas. You're not in Kansas anymore, are you, Joe? So, tell us just briefly your story from Texas to Tel Aviv.
Well, I don't know if it's so Texas related, other than the fact that was where I was born. In the embodiment piece, I was just born in the body. I was a boy that liked to play with sticks and balls and running around, and the heady stuff. Even though I can be quite mental and cerebral these days, it wasn't my beginning, and I thrived through movement. And basically, back then it was playing and sports, and it was often the same thing. And it was clearly where I actually excelled. And I did have a very interesting experience when I was about 3. That's in my memory. I was somewhere around 3 years old, and I was sitting on the front porch of our house in suburban Texas, Dallas, Texas, outside of Dallas, a place called Farmers Branch. And I had some type of witnessing experience, which was somehow disembodied. I was somehow, outside of my personality. And as my 3-year-old mind didn't really know what it was. It just, at the same time, it was very clear that it was not part of my conceptual view of the world. And it always stuck with me. I had no way to frame it or relate to it or understand it or rationalize it, but it stuck with me as a reference point. And as I grew up, whenever I experienced, the difficulties and the suffering in life, as it's just, when the holding environment is not out of balance in one way or the other, that was somehow a reference point for me. It wasn't something that I always longed for when I was young, but it's a reference point that always stayed with me. So that reference point, together with, in a way, childhood flow states. When I was doing sports, I was like high as a kite, and I was just like doing my thing, and that was the best for me. So I always looked for those moments, and I did every day. I was outside playing, and then that reference point of some type of being out of the limited sense of self stuck with me. And then as I grew up, kind of Bruce Lee, I guess for many people, he was kind of an iconic figure. I graduated from comic book heroes to Bruce Lee, and that became like an archetype that I was searching for, because Bruce Lee had those two things coming together. I was also doing martial arts, and he also had this kind of spiritual aspect. And then it was through other certain experiences, coming into contact with Buddhist ideas and coming into contact with people with the teachings of Carlos Castaneda and Don Juan, talking about impeccability, that a warrior is impeccable. And that was something that always took me back to that reference point. So these two parallel lines are something I'd always sought, like what I say now is flow states, but actually finding my greatest authentic sense of freedom of being and excelling through the body and movement and sports and martial arts, plus some seeking of spiritual awakening, to be out of the matrix somehow, to be out of suffering. So those two things actually drove me quite far. And at the beginning, martial arts encapsulated those two things because it was a spiritual path that it was martial practice. Aikido was a spiritual art. So those two things took it far. But then actually, after spending, I left Texas when I was 25, moved to Japan, did Aikido there for 8 years and kind of excelled in the dojo.
You were a live-in student as well, right? So it wasn't like you were just kind of going once a week or something like that.
Yeah, I went to like a really, for those who don't know Aikido, I just went to kind of an old-fashioned hardcore style dojo, traditional. And I just trained and I loved it. I was training every day, 20 hours a week. And I thrived in that for 8 years. And then at the end of those 8 years, actually it was more like after 5 years, I started realizing that I'm kind of hitting a glass ceiling, that the physical alone, even though I was getting excellent, wasn't taking me to where I wanted to go, wasn't getting me back to that some type of authenticity. Well, the authenticity I always got in the training, but that some type of spiritual release, that perspective that I knew that I was looking for. And those eventually drove me, sent me seeking on to Burma, where I studied, as you said, Vipassana meditation for another 3 years, and then coming back to the marketplace a few years later. And I guess the last 10 years have really been about integrating, re-embodying myself in the world and the marketplace, and bringing those two paths together.
Yeah, so I met you at this very interesting event in Cyprus, this peace event with Aikido from around the world and various kind of warring countries, the Middle East and places like that. And that was, I guess, you were sort of coming to the end of that period of being a disciple, as it were. And then after that, you went and set up a dojo in Tel Aviv, right?
That's right. I ended up in Israel. I didn't move to Israel. I ended up, but it was quite conscious choice to return to the marketplace, for two reasons, thinking, number one, I needed to return to the marketplace. I needed to integrate back into the world because I was 16 years out of society.
So maybe people aren't aware of that, the ox herding pictures. So the marketplace is this, you want to say a little bit about that?
Well, it's very simple. We all start kind of, we live in the relative world in societies, and we get a glimpse of the absolute, like when I was a child, that experience that stick with us. It's strong enough to be implanted in our consciousness, and it reminds us, it's like a reference point that there's something greater than this kind of little world that we live in, egoistic world that we live in. So we go seeking for it, and then we might have deeper experiences of that. We commit to practices. We follow paths of practice that take us beyond our limitations, working all this good stuff. And then we have some type of awakening that's more or less stable, and some type of deeper experience of the absolute or non-dual perspective. And it's the best. It's just, you are released from all suffering. And I was actually, the 8 years that I was kind of following the meditation path, I had one relationship that I ended up finishing because I was more committed to the meditation, and it was extremely painful, because it was deep love. I was like, we fell in love deeply, but I knew that I was going to keep following this path. So we ended it. And, for the next year meditating, I was just, thinking about her all the time. And it was just such a painful thing. So I actually, 3 years, I was very, I actually was celibate. I didn't get involved with relationships. I tried to keep life simple, just follow that path. And then, you have certain experiences, certain awakenings, and it's just the best. It's like really literally being at the top of the mountain, looking down on all the shit in the world, and none of it's touching you, none of it's affecting you. And that's, in and of itself, it's beautiful. It really is a liberation. And yet, when you go back down the mountain and return back to the marketplace, everything that all the issues you had when you left are just there waiting for you.
Because we both did this, right? Like I was a living Aikido
exactly.
for a few years. I went off and, I lived like a Zen monk, and I kind of did my thing, and lots of retreats and all that. And it was great. And now, we're in the weird position now that you and I kind of talk about all sorts of great stuff when we get together. You're one of my favorite people to talk with. And, these days we talk about like marketing funnels, and you talk about your kid and I talk about my wife. And it's like we talk about the real kind of household stuff as well as all the other stuff still. But it's very interesting. We were just talking about Zoom as a platform before we Miles like, oh, you're gonna love Zoom. You can use it for your calls, and I was like, oh, cool, it's much better than Skype. And it's like we have those very, how would you call them, householder conversations now. Absolutely.
And it's like for me right now, marketing, I've discovered, because there's a whole art to marketing and persuasion and how to, ethical presentation of your gift to the world in a way. That's the way I look at it. Advocating for the view you have. it's like one of the deepest spiritual practices I've ever done, and it's one of the most difficult. It really is.
It's challenging. And it's tough, right? To stand in the market square, the internet market square, and shout and say, "Look, this is what I'm doing. This is worth buying." I've had this experience 3 times. I've taught on various courses about yoga and about cancer, even, and about purpose. And in all 3 of these courses, I got a standing ovation for the piece I taught on marketing, which freaks me out because I'm not a marketing person. I've just got basically competent at it. But what I realized was it's really lacking from a lot of the alternative space, and people really need that to make a living and get what they do out there. And, it's weird that I've ended up in a place where I'm helping people with their marketing. I couldn't have imagined that in a million years as a living Aikido student. And that seems to be one of the things they're appreciating most because it's real, it's practical. It's like, no, I actually want to get my stuff out there, Well,
if we look at it, I mean, this is the Embodiment podcast. So if we look at this whole move to the top of the mountain is really a non-materialistic move. We have to work hard to get out of materiality, to get liberated somehow. And then we have to come back and re-inhabit materiality. We have to re-inhabit the body. And these ox-herding pictures that you said, the final one is the returning. So it starts with, being in the relative, being cut off from the absolute. Then you get a glimpse of the absolute. You practice. Then you have an absolute perspective, top of the mountain. Then you come back to the mountain, and the job is to find the relative within the absolute. Yeah. Before it was all about finding the absolute in the relative, having a state experience, a great experience at a concert or a party or a yoga class or an Aikido class. Like, wow, that was great. I want more. But then you get that, and now it's all about bringing that back into the relative. Bring your so-called spiritual perspective into relationships. Bring it into money.
Marriage would be the other one I'd say. Yeah,
marriage. Yeah, exactly.
Parenting, I guess, for you as well too, huh?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Parenting. Oh my God, biggest.
They're the big 3: money, relationships, and parenting. They're the things that people are most interested in my workshops. That's where the rubber meets the road.
And power is in all of them. So that's, and power is the other, but that's kind of goes through all of them. And the final stage in the returning to the marketplace is the integration of the relative and the absolute, the integration of spirituality and materiality.
Okay, so let's take a step back. We tend to be enthusiasts, don't we, and dive into a kind of a latest
to the races.
That's right. So let's start with Aikido. You're actually the first Aikido teacher. I know you're much more than that, but the first Aikido teacher I've had on here. I'm guessing there's going to be a few just because of the people I know. I'm on the podcast. Right. I'm reaching out to yoga teachers and body therapists and dancers. Right. I'm going to make it broad, but just by way of my network, some of the most interesting people I know are Aikido teachers. So as the first one on, why don't you say just the sort of, what is Aikido, first of all?
Well, Aikido is and should be, and I actually take this line from NVC, which I know you're a big, you're pretty deep into the nonviolent communication. But I see Aikido as kind of the world's only, in essence, it's exceptional. It's not a unique, exceptional. It's the world's only 100% life affirming martial art.
Yeah, it's a non-violent martial art, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what makes it unusual, not the wrist locks or the arm locks or the throws, which you might find in other arts. Yeah.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean that people aren't hurting each other and having accidents and leaving massive somatic imprints on each other, negative somatic imprints, not positive ones. That's happening all the time. But in the sense, that we are moving towards wholeness. And I think that the whole universe is actually moving towards greater wholeness. And Aikido is and nonviolent communication, for that matter, is a methodology, a practice that helps that. You have 2 bodies coming together, trying to occupy the same place at the same time, either ideologically, or emotionally, or possessively, or just spatially, and that creates a conflict. Everything inside of us screams fight, flight, or freeze. You press my boundaries and your boundaries, press close enough together. Or like you're so good at, Mark, you're so good at seeing people's, what can I say, limitations or attachment to worldviews or whatever, and you have this kind of knack of saying
my acupuncture provocations of poking the dim mac point of their soul.
Great. So you enter into a space where 2 views can't stay at the same time, and something has to happen. And everything inside of us, everything inside of our human conditioning, biological human conditioning, is fight, flight, freeze. And Aikido first teaches us to kind of create a container of awareness, of mindfulness, of centering, to contain that craziness, that crisis moment, contain it, center, breathe. Once we're centered, once we're breathing, then connect. And miraculously, and this is really where there's this kind of whole miraculous side of Aikido, if we're centered and grounded and open and available and connected to another person who also shifts into being centered, grounded, available, and connected, then solutions just appear. They happen. They miraculously, creatively, they come out. And that's the core, the juice of Aikido. Whether we're doing that all the time or whether that's happening all the time, which it probably usually isn't, is secondary.
Yeah, I mean, you're someone who's very well placed to say what Aikido is and isn't, in that, you trained with kind of one of the main students of the founder of Aikido intensely for some years. It's a controversial thing, but the idea of Aikido as a non-violent martial art, technically, people might see I sometimes explain it as, imagine two people doing Tai Chi together quickly, where one of them sort of rolls away. People may have seen the sort of black hackemers, which are sort of skirt-like things people wear. You might have seen the weapons with the sticks. People always ask me, is that the one with the sticks? I don't know where that came from.
Right, yeah. Or even, I mean, there's a lot of, in the kind of cheap martial arts cinema space, there's a lot of, Aikido that's used for rather violent purposes, but that's also kind of, it kind of comes from those roots.
Yeah, and then the key thing here is it's often, not always, but it's often used as a personal growth practice. So it's a do rather than jitsu, right? That people are, it's not so much about throwing people across the room. In fact, it's not a particularly practical, quick way to learn self-defense, but there's this idea that it can be an art for personal growth.
Right. And the do, which means, the Tao, the way in Japanese, it's a path, but it's not an ordinary path. It's a higher path. And that higher path basically means that my basic instincts, my lower instincts, if I can use lower and higher, just as a kind of a model, my basic instincts of desires and preferences and fears, etc., will be challenged with every step of the path. Great. And it'll be challenged for me to either choose the path, which means open awareness, connecting, accepting, etc., or contracting into my egoic, my basic, and which also at a basic level are healthy egoic reactions and drives. So
this is what you call a lovely model, the evolution of response, right? And people can find that online. Maybe you can send us a link afterwards. There's some nice pieces I've seen you do on that. And this could apply to a martial art, which is a great training ground, but it could apply to anything. It could apply to, arguing with your partner about the bills or whatever it is.
Yeah, and this is also, it's, we talked about this kind of the ox herding pictures. The evolution of response is that too. First, we center for, to really get out of our reactivity, we have to center within ourselves and kind of create a container of awareness. Once I'm established in that, physically, mentally, emotionally, then I can connect with others. Now it does have a resonance, a mirror neuron effect on others to where they can also do that, and we create an access of connection. Once we're connected, then interesting things begin to happen, especially if one open and aware centered individual connects with another open and aware centered individual, then it creates an open and aware centered system that is by nature inherently creative, spontaneous, and unpredictable, and also holistic, always moving towards mo.
So that's the sort of creative Takamushi Aiki, is that they call it in Aikido, that the sort of generative side that comes out of it. But as you say, there's a series of processes there. And the first thing is to be aware, notice, oh, look, I'm all fucked up. The second thing is like, check that out. I was in the phone shop a few months ago, and I was just noticing how angry I was. The guy was ripping me off my mobile phone. I'm like, okay, I need to walk away now, Aikido boys. And
I was in that same state a few minutes ago here in Israel.
Really? In Israel? Who would have thought it would have happened there? But, I always find Israel is like, there's always some irritation in Tel Aviv, certain cities like Moscow or Tel Aviv.
Constant.
Bashing, this kind of edgy bashing, there's always a taxi driver ripping me off, or, it's a lovely place. It's a beautiful place. I went on holiday there with my wife, so I don't want to, listening in Tel Aviv to think I'm bad-mouthing Tel Aviv, but it has a certain energy, we might say.
It does, absolutely.
So it's being aware of it, and then you have to get yourself together, so you need some kind of tools for that. And you've done like an online thing about centering as well, right? So I just did an hour-long podcast on centering. Say a bit more about that, like techniques you use, things you find effective.
Yeah, so about the Buddhist thing, the Buddhist said that mindfulness is helpful in all things, which basically means that mindfulness, of course, is the core practice in Theravada Buddhism. I would even go as far as saying much of Buddhism. But any type of developmental practice, whatever you want to call it, including centering, it's a practice of mindfulness. And the reason when you say mindfulness is helpful in all things, that's an absolute statement. That means that there's no exceptions. Yeah. All time, all places, all circumstances, mindfulness is helpful. Yeah. Doesn't mean it's going to be magic, but it adds benefit. So the basic centering practice is basically a mindfulness practice. It's a practice of awareness. And that's what I was talking about, walking the path. Every step on the path of practice is, in a very basic sense, a step of awareness, a step of self-awareness. And when we commit to a path, whether it's, a path to learn marketing or a path to become enlightened or a path to take up Aikido or yoga, whatever it is, we're committing to putting awareness in the center of our life.
Yeah.
More than not. Not saying that we're going to be perfect, because of course we're not, but it's more than not. So centering, which is an embodied practice on the mind on the level of the mind, is about awareness. On the level of the body, it's about, the physical center of the body and the organizing principle of how we kind of organize ourselves as a body. And I know you work with so many things, like, what is it, depth and width and height?
Oh, there's so many ways to do it. It could just be balancing structure, relaxing core. I mean, there's a whole load of ways. I think I just logged, I wrote an ebook, 100-page ebook on centering, and logged at least 60 different techniques in there.
Right.
Some of them are real simple. They're like, pull in and relax your belly, or, sit in a more balanced way. Really.
Relax the tongue. I love Paul. I mean, look at Paul. If you look at Paul, he's in some ways ravaged. His body's ravaged by, Parkinson's, but his mind is still incredibly sharp. But the guy's just centered, He just he's living proof of what he's teaching. It's amazing.
Oh, he's like that at 3 a.m. Like, he stayed at my house for a course, and he stumbled. I was sleeping outside. I had a smaller house then. I was like, I gave him my bed, and he kind of was stumbling to go to the toilet, like an old guy, like at 3 a.m. And he didn't know who I was, because he was sort of confused from his Parkinson's meditation, and he was half asleep. And he was just, even then he was like, "Oh, hello, who are you?" And was just sort of consistently loving and centered at 3 a.m, not knowing his own name. I thought, okay, that's pretty good going. I'm not there yet.
That's cool. Well, look, now why do we need centering? Because our tendency is to come up and out, especially. And again, this is where it's, Aikido, but it's really certainly not limited to physical conflict. But especially in moments when the system is in crisis, it could be conflict with another person, physical, mental, emotional, political, whatever, or it could be just having a stressful internal experience. Our experience is to kind of come up and out of the center. And once we've done that, we're disconnected from the moment. We're in the future, we're in the past, and we're just in reactive patterns. We're repeating the past. No matter what we do, it's just a repetition of the past, which, usually doesn't lead to any type of new.
So it's historical patterns playing out rather than being present, and kind of a generative, kind of new creative patterns happening. And there's no real connection there, right? Like, there was someone saying some crazy stuff online to me last night, as is typical. And I thought, this person isn't seeing me. I wasn't even angry, I was like, this is their stuff from the past. And I feel sad for them, but we can't even have a conversation until they're in the present moment. Yeah, exactly. So they're actually reading what I said in this case, it was, there's no relationship possible.
And that's the cool thing. I mean, that's where it comes into Aikido, because this, we're talking about in physical conflict space, because that's Aikido, but it actually relates to everything. And when we're up and out, we're not connected to the moment. If we're not connected to the moment, we can't connect to the other. If we can't connect to the other, we can't listen to them. We can't even attempt to take their worldview. Yeah. So, Donald Trump, for example, he kind of triggers me to go up and out. Really, I was just like that, whatever, let's not get started. But actually, that doesn't help. That just, as we say in Aikido, it just perpetuates conflict.
Sure.
It's repeating history in an endless loop. I
think he's a good place to talk about shadow as well, right? Because there's mindfulness and there's present moment awareness, but then that's not the whole picture, right? Like there's sort of Eastern traditions, where I see someone like Donald Trump is obviously, his character seems to be pretty obnoxious. And I don't agree with the vast majority of his policies. So just in case people misinterpret this, I'll say that as a disclaimer. And there's a way in which he embodies shadow of money, sex, power. Some of the most triggering things he represents, like a rich guy.
He's a manifestation of the American shadow.
Like, say more about that, because that's fascinating stuff. Like, we talked about awareness. Let's talk about what's hard to be aware of, this idea of shadow.
Well, I like to say that spirituality is everything, because it really is. As you start to think, spirituality is everything and is not enough. because spirituality doesn't get to shadow. Shadow is that thing that we can't see. You, especially you, Mark, because you have a sharp eye, you've been around, you can see it. You're outside of me, you can see my shadow operating. But me, I can't see it at all.
We can't see our own stuff, right? This is why we need friends and therapists and mentors and people that can put it up.
Exactly. Friends, therapists, mentors. We need somebody on the outside. We need somebody outside as a mirror reflecting it in. And that could be it could be a big ugly mirror that's insensitive and whatever, or it could be actually somebody who's just bringing awareness because that's what they choose, to bring awareness to the middle of the relationship. But we need that reflection to see shadow. And in that sense, somebody like Donald Trump, he's a manifestation of the American shadow, and it's a perfect moment to actually learn and understand. And the fact is, if I don't, I can perpetuate and just, be an activist and whatever, because I'm not a fan of Mr. Trump, and I'm not a fan of his policies and politics and lack of policies, I should say.
So there's the external work, which is well worth doing, right? It's like, okay, how do we get a better president? There's an external piece of work,
right?
And
then there's the internal inside of me. But for me to really do the work inside of me in the world, I have to start to understand the inside of him, which means that I have got to embody and inhabit the space, the body, the inner space of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Which, it's very repulsive to do that.
Who wants to? I did an exercise where I stepped into the embodiments of various leaders, and I did May and Corbyn from the UK, the main prime minister and the opposition leader, and I did Putin. That was weird, kind of fun. This is my Putin mug. I was in Russia at the time. They asked me to do this is my Putin does judo mug. He's a 6-degree black belt at judo, believe it or not.
I know, yeah.
Combat KGB Sambo, I think. And then I did Trump, and Trump was by far the most disturbing one to do. I did it for about 10 minutes. It was the weirdest feeling.
It's totally weird.
Coming into his embodiment. And that's just someone that's pretty okay with like money, sex, and power. There are three things I kind of do pretty well on the kind of lower chakra stuff. I think it's why I also trigger people. I own that stuff quite solidly. And even with that, I found it very hard. And he seems to be expressing things in, of course, obnoxious ways. So please, we're going to have to keep saying that, or people will hear us. That are super common to disown. I mean, the three biggest themes that I see in all my clients disowning are money, sex, and power. Or you could just say power and money and sex as kind of expressions of power. I've done workshops on power where you kind of go up, emotional power, cognitive power, spiritual power, but those sort of lower chakra power, he seems to embody that. And there's definitely a way in which a lot of my more spiritual friends or more kind of left-leaning friends are
bypassing that,
trying to go straight to the spiritual. Like, what's a spiritual bypass? That might be a new idea for some people as well. Might be one you can speak about.
Well, it's the same. So I think that our work is to actually awaken our chakras all the way up and then inhabit them all the way down. It's got to go both ways, and it won't go both ways at the same time. We really have to do the work to the top of the mountain and do the work to returning to the marketplace. But the bypass is really about the shadow. It's something that we just don't want to deal with. Yeah, it's kind of uncomfortable, and we don't like it when people reflect it to us. And so we go where it's maybe feels better, or maybe we go where we feel that it should be, even if it doesn't feel good. Like meditation for sure doesn't feel good. But I can have the idea that this is good for me and do it.
And we've seen again and again and again in the world of martial arts, in the world of meditation, in the world of yoga, the kind of abusers in power who haven't worked with their own shadow, right? It's not just the occasional person, it's endemic. And there's certain reasons for that, maybe in the practice or in the systems, but it definitely seems to be a missing piece there. Just the amount of meditation teachers or Aikido teachers being involved with scandals of various kinds. It's a little bit above the average, shall we say, that, I can't imagine the world of accountancy is quite so ridden with it.
Yeah, well, we're back to power, because they're in the position of power. I'm in a position of power. You're in a position of power. And if we don't have an ethical, moral compass, forget the standards and codes and stuff like that, but we don't have an inner ethical and moral compass to match that level of power that people give us, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, I was starting to get some success in my career, and I was in a conference in the Ukraine. I was asked to do some trauma work around the war, and their economy had crashed because of the war with Russia, the undeclared war, and so they couldn't pay me very much. But I turned up, and I looked, and there was a room. There's 100 people in this room, 90 of whom were women, and 80 of whom looked like models, basically, because it's the Ukraine. and they were looking at me with big wide eyes, and I was introduced as like the great teacher from England who was here, you know, without much money to help us in our time of need. And I just looked at the front row and I went, whoa, this is really dangerous.
Yeah, I had the exact same experience, not in the same place, but in a very similar way. I remember looking up from a class once after I was probably in some type of flow, you know how it is when you teach.
Yeah, I'm doing my thing. Yeah.
Right? And, you know, there's nothing sexier. And I mean that in a pure way. There's nothing sexier than somebody who's being authentic.
Yeah, they're on purpose. They're authentic. You're contributing to the world in a way which is coming from your strengths and your gifts. And you're in this position of authority, right? And it's like, whoa.
And when you look out
that.
Yeah, and you got the audience, which is great because you wanna lead them someplace. But then you also I had this sudden realization. Oh my God, this is huge. There's a huge responsibility here. You know, the kind of the Spider-Man thing, the power and the responsibility is just like, you know. And I knew that also that I wasn't necessarily mature enough to be responsible for it.
Yeah, for sure.
So I always threw in really strong kind of guidelines to kind of, in a way, protect me from falling over. And I fell a few times here and there. Nothing horrible, but still.
Yeah, similar. I fucked up. No ways that I think, you know, ruined anyone's life or anything, but certainly not, you know, some things that I regret. But having codes and structures really helps, doesn't it? And maybe we can talk a little bit more about sort of form and freedom here, you know, like, because on the one hand, you do the most crazy ass creative hippie Aikido to music I've ever seen, really original, creative. But on the other hand, you're like straight from the book, Owamaru. This is for those who don't know Aikido.
Well, no, I'm not Owamaru anymore, but I do like classical technique.
Sure, but classical technique, right? Even if you don't have that association perhaps anymore, there's that. I've seen you do very structured, formal Aikido and meditation, you know, very structured, formal meditation retreats that have 10 days.
Totally.
You know, there's this form and then this creativity. I think we might differ a little bit on this one, but it could be some fun to explore. What's your view on the relationship between those things?
Well, a few things. I mean, evolution, you know, when things grow and evolve, it's always unpredictable. It's always spontaneous. From the inside, it's going and it's always like, yes, this is where wholeness wants to go. Yep. And it moves that direction. And yet, if we stand back from the outside and we look at that process, we can say, hang on, there was a structure there.
Yeah.
You know, we can, maybe not in the moment, we might need to look back a year later or 10 years later and say, oh, wow, wait a second. They needed to get into their center. They needed to kind of become responsible for themselves. They needed to kind of own their shit before they could really be healthy and clean with other people. Once they're healthy and clean with other people, then they're able to guide them in creative ways. I mean, we can see that from the outside, but from the inside, you don't see that at all. And it doesn't really matter. My favorite quote, which really inhabits, this whole thing, is from Picasso. If people are watching or listening now, if you Google Picasso and you go to the image or say early Picasso and you click images on Google, you'll see all his early paintings. And, you know, a nose is a nose, a face is a face, everything's symmetrical. He's like, he mastered the classics. I think he had, whatever, I forget his background, but he was trained in the classics. And then at some point he just became Picasso, and perspectivalism just went nuts, and he was a master of creative art. And then, you know, later in his later years, he said, you know, he has this beautiful quote, learn the rules like a pro so you can break the rules like an artist. And both of those have to be completely equal. Now, some people just want to break the rules and be artistic. Other people are a little bit, you know, like Sisyphus, stuck to the rules, indefinitely pushing that fucking boulder up the mountain, sliding back, and it's like, okay, a little bit more, another Aikido, a little bit more Aikido, I'm going to become a master.
Yeah, you see that in Aikido, don't you? They just repeat the same classic form again and again and again for 40 years. Yeah.
I think you see that more in Aikido than you do the freedom side. You know? So I think you said something Aikido is really good about containing emotions, but not very good about expressing.
Yeah, it tends to. So there's martial arts generally, I see, tend to have a sort of regulatory crowd that's drawn to them, either because they incline towards that or because they need that. And then I was in 5 Rhythms Dance last night, which is the opposite. You know, everyone's screaming and crying and rolling around the floor. Yeah, right. You know, they can probably do it a bit more fucking
wide open. Yeah, exactly. And that was a big thing. And I went through that. I went through the learning the rules like a pro, and I really learned the rules like a pro, and I can teach the rules like a pro. But at this point in my life, I never lose contact with the fact that the only reason we're doing this is so we can break the fucking rules like an artist.
Yeah.
And if those are balanced, if you're like, if you've like maxed out the learning of the rules to where you're no longer dogmatic or attached to those rules, you can be completely free. It's like also like, I see one is Sisyphus and the other is Icarus. Those are the two ways we can go wrong. Sisyphus was stuck to discipline.
Yeah.
Icarus was intoxicated with freedom. But we need to find a balance, and a little bit of Icarus would have take Sisyphus a long ways, and vice versa. So we have to have that balance. Now, when I teach, I do like to give structure, curriculum, more in the early stages of a person's development, and then take them beyond into the freedom.
People need more structure earlier, don't they? And as a teacher, it's like you need to give people structure early so they're kind of not completely lost, and then give them and loosen the kind of boundaries a bit with that later on. And this is cultural too. Like when I teach in Russia, people
that's what I was going to say. It's totally
isn't so good with that, right? You don't want to tell them this is the 5 steps to how you do this, or else they'll be like, "Fuck you, I'll do it how I want."
Well, same thing. And when I was teaching in the West Bank in Palestine, they're bringing their phones on the mat, they're bringing their shoes on the mat, they're training, they're rolling in all directions, which is crazy and dangerous. And the kids are running around, and so it's like, wait a second, guys. We sit down and we in a way, I kind of train these guys like the army. Let's make a line. Let's be regimented for a little bit, and then we can start to loosen up.
I remember Jose and I were teaching a class in the slums of Brazil, and it was like a 2-hour class for these kind of the kids in this real poor area, kind of favela area. And the whole first hour of a 2-hour class was just trying to get the kids to line up in a straight line, and it took an hour, but it was like, no, this is actually useful. This is not just as a prerequisite to teaching, because otherwise it's just pure chaos and it's dangerous, but also because like that's what these kids need. They needed some structure and boundaries. They were from families where that wasn't there. Drugs were available to them, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, okay, this is actually a worthwhile thing to do, to spend an hour on lining up in a straight line. And it was like cat herding. It was hell of hard work, but valuable. And what was interesting, actually, I worked a lot with kids, is when you provide structure like that, there might be some resistance, but they actually like it as long as there's love with that, and it's not just rolling.
And the love is the
kids love it. They'd absolutely love that. And I've been at like hippie festivals where the sort of liberal children of sort of liberal parents with no boundaries and structures will sort of come to me wanting that structure and discipline because they see it in the system as a martial artist. And as I said, students get older, it's good to loosen that out a bit. Like I'm the senior student at the Aikido club I train at now, and the teachers are real cool with me. They give me a lot of space to play and do variation techniques and explore, because they get that what I need. But the new guy, they're not doing that space, giving that space to, because they want him to learn the basics and the structure. Is there a risk though in that, I've seen Aikido, and I'll stay with Aikido as an example because we share that. This could apply to anything, tango or any other form.
Yoga.
You spend 10 years learning the structure, you just get indoctrinated. You just
totally. Is there a risk? Risk,
right?
It happens more often than not. And that's the problem. Yeah. I find that more people are stuck in their form than they reach the point to their form kind of liberated to the point where they're trapped.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing. Limitations should actually the greater the limitation, it should be balanced with the greater freedom. It should really give you freedom. And we were talking about ethical guidelines before and morality. At the beginning, we have to have these extra, don't kill, don't steal, don't lie. Don't
keep it straightforward, simple, yeah.
So, and those are external, and I kind of plant them in my unconscious or my superego, and I go through life. But as I mature, certainly spiritually, but as I mature as humanistically, those become internalized, and I can relax them a little bit. But then at a certain point, a spiritually mature consciousness would never harm another person, would never steal, would never say something false, misrepresent the truth in any way. It doesn't do that. So as we mature, those structures relax, and it becomes a natural expression of who we are. And it should be the same thing in any type of creative art.
Yeah, and then there's another danger, isn't there? At that point, is the Aikido becomes sloppy, or the morality becomes, I've seen people say I'm spiritually beyond rules, and it's like, no, it's okay for me to sleep with my student or rip them off because it's a special.
We're both adults.
Or something like this,
We're both adults, and I'm helping her, and or she's helping me, or whatever it is.
And at that point, it's like, maybe go back to your original basic rules, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think I've found that when I'm working with students about ethics, it's nice to have an external guide, mentors, peers, accountability, but also, this internal sense of like, well, actually, this is a little different. You know, there can be that like genuine kind of feeling into, but having some checks and balances there in terms of the general system, you know. I think that's underrated in terms of structures. Things like I have a colleague, Frankie, who I co-teach with, and he has veto power over anything I decide to do on a training. So
that's smart. Yeah.
One year I said, okay, great, we're going to offer people like tattoos when they graduate. And Frankie was like, no, we're not.
Like the paste on tattoos?
No, like real tattoos. I was like, let's get a tattoo artist in, like, you know, completed the course, you get a tattoo, you know? And Frankie was just like, we're not doing that. And I was like, oh, okay. You know, and now I look back at it and go, yeah, that was the right call. We weren't going to force some people, but, you know, so he was like, no, there's no way you can do that. And this is why. And, you know, even less fun in Israel.
So let's just, you know, that's why I love the, you know, the whole idea of Zen koans, and we can even say the embodied koan. Yes, we want to be able to plant a flag and say, look, this is the truth. This is where this is my line. I'm doing what I say. But at the same time, we want to be able to say, well, and stay open to more. And I think that, you know, that's the whole thing of learning the rules and learning the rules like a pro, breaking the rules like an artist. You know, we want to be both. And not in a dualistic sense where it's a contradiction or I'm flipping back and forth, but in where both of those are like absolutely yes.
Yeah.
Right now, forever and always.
Yeah, that's real tricky, isn't it? It's real tricky. And I'll say something.
It's tricky for the ego. It's tricky for the divided, separate sense of self.
Which of these two things is true? It's like, well, they're both true, you know? But the big mind stuff's good for that, isn't it? You've done some big mind meditation, I know, and sort of seeing different sides of things. All right, slightly change of track here. So we talk about some of the peace stuff you've done. I think that'll be pretty interesting to people. You've done Aikido Across Borders, right? So, like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Aikido Without Borders is the organization that we have here in Israel. And I guess right now it's kind of on hiatus. I was going to the West Bank and teaching in Ramallah, in the village near Ramallah, in Bir Nabala, for about 8 years. And basically, you know, I see, part of my decision to move to Israel was that, okay, it's time for me to come back to the marketplace.
Yeah.
Challenging marketplace. So right on. I love challenges. And to offer my teaching, offer my gifts to the world in places that it's needed. So that was kind of maybe idealistic, but also altruistic. And I was like, I was 16 years out of the States. I thought, okay, man, I'm going to go back to the States. I always thought I'd go back to the States and do that. But then I was teaching here. I was here, spending a lot of time here. Had a relationship here. So, and I'm Jewish, so I can actually live here if I wanted to. And I'm thinking, okay, what? At the beginning, perhaps I'll live here in Israel. I thought, there's no way. It's just too crazy. You know, it's kind of energetically rough here. The seeds don't really take root here. You know, all kinds of projects and whatever. And the conflict was just too crazy. And then at a certain point, it was so crazy. I was thinking, well, maybe, you know, it's like, I can't not do it.
Yeah.
So part of that actually was involved with, you know, contribute some type of, wouldn't even say bringing peace to the Middle East, but certainly creating bridges, connecting the disconnected parts of the world.
Yeah, and it is an intense place, isn't it? I mean, I've done workshops there where we had to take breaks for Hamas rocket attacks, but even when there's not like an active conflict going on, I must have been there about 20 times, so, you know, fair few visits there. It's intense. Like, you know, I remember there's a lot of trauma held in people's bodies, which plays out in different ways. Like, I was on everybody's body. So it's there, just there, because, you know, people's grandparents are in the Holocaust, and then there's been 10 wars or however many it is since then.
A lot of
restaurant on the beach, and a girl just like threw the waitress, completely empty restaurant, no rush. She comes up to me, throws the menu on the table like it was a javelin, you know, and it's like, what do you want? She says to me in Hebrew, and I'm just like, wow, we're on the beach. It's not busy. It's relaxed. Like, this could be a more chilled out place. So it's not like the environment like New York City or something, right?
Yeah.
And I just looked at her and I was just aware the level of sort of hyperarousal and like tension she was holding. And, you know, part of this is cultural. I'm English. And I spent a month in Israel once. And when I came back, everyone in England thought I was even ruder than normal. I was just abrasive. There's a sort of cultural body. And I say this, again, with love for the place and with many Israeli friends and students. Yeah. But there's a trauma held in the body there, isn't there?
There's a trauma held in the earth here. It's kind of a trauma, like in somatic experience, they call Israel a trauma vortex, and it's really just spinning around here, and it impacts and affects everything and everyone, and it just takes a real conflict, like an intifada, to happen, to where you realize that it's just always there, and there's no place in the world that's more in need of healing than this region, and that was kind of my intention in doing the peace work. And I guess I began to understand that my biggest problems in life, Miles's personal problems that I had in life were because I was divided within myself. Yeah. Parts of myself were disconnected, split, or cut off, in my shadow. And it just went about causing me suffering, and usually people around me suffering in the world. And as I started to do that work more and more, realizing that I have to connect the different parts of myself together and heal and integrate.
It's very dangerous trying to do the external work without doing the internal work, isn't it? I'm looking at a lot of the sort of and things happen in the US and the UK. Yeah. I've worked with activists quite a bit, and there's a sort of inner game there, isn't there? And if that's not done, I mean, if nothing else, it's not compelling to anyone else.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of rage and the lack of listening, and the rage might come from somewhere totally justified, like, you people have been mistreated, and oppression, and there's inequality, and there's racism, and there's all these things. And when there's that embodiment of rage, there's no conversation, and nobody wants to listen to that. It's just like, no, what else is on the TV? Yeah,
because it's toxic. It's coming from their own shadow. It's not coming from out there in the world, even though they can hook it on what's going on in the world.
Sure. And I think there's a real danger in the world now of saying it's the blaming of the external. It's because of them. I have this problem because of them. My life's a mess because of them. And there's truth in that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm from an Irish immigrant family, it's like, haven't always had the easiest time, with racism in my family towards Irish people. It's real common in the UK, particularly during the IRA days, for example. Right. The IRA were blowing stuff up. It's, there was real racism there, but to not use that to say, it's not about me, it's about you. And that kind of finger that points out, it doesn't seem particularly helpful.
But that's human nature. That's what we do.
It's what we do, I guess.
Yeah. And our work is actually to do that with awareness. So I can point my finger at Trump, and I might be pointing from reactivity, because I don't want to deal with it, how he makes me feel, or I could be doing it, justified in a clean and clear, justified way. Yes, there's some problems there that need to be dealt with, and if we don't step up and do it, then it's going to even be worse. So it is both. And we do need to do that work, but it's the internal work, like you said, that's key.
And you seem to be talking more and more about wholeness and this return to wholeness.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And a good way to a good indicator of that, if we look at the situation, just look at the wall between Israel and Palestine. You've seen it. You've been there. You've kind of
been right up to it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's an offense to humanity. On just a very basic level. Forget why it was there and its function and all this other stuff. Sure. It's a basic offense to humanity, and it kind of sickens you on one level. On another level, rationally, it's like, okay, well, there's consequences, the reasons it was let up, and it actually
some very practical reasons, and it reduced terrorist attacks and blah blah blah. You can make some really good cases for it, but sort of this idea of building walls between people as a solution.
And then you realize that actually that separation just makes the situation worse.
Yeah.
The same thing within me. If I can't handle these two parts, Aikido is about conflict. You and I get together, we can't occupy the same place at the same time. Well, if I have conflicting desires and hopes and dreams and whatever within myself that can't be held in the same moment at the same time, then I have the same type of inner conflict. So I just put a wall between there. I numb myself out with drinking or whatever.
Yeah. And Aikido asks something very unreasonable, doesn't it? Which is what we're asked of in the world too, which is someone's trying to attack you, and you're still, you have to be calm, take responsibility for yourself, which is, I just want to blame them. Well, of course I'm freaked out. They're attacking me. Yeah. And the second thing is then to protect that person. And that's an unreasonable thing to ask.
It's so hard, man.
But what else is there? What else is there?
What else is there is repeating the past.
Exactly, right? Just a cycle of trauma and violence, and
exactly right.
Traumatizes more people.
And that's, I think, where the internal work is important. And anybody who's doing embodied work, if you're not touching your emotional issues through your embodiment work, then something's wrong.
Yeah, I'd say that's physical work, not embodied work. And it's possible to do martial arts from a purely muscular physical point of view. And even like I see this with sort of intense styles of hot yoga. I know they're very popular in Israel, America, and Britain. Very intense styles of yoga. I think people are actually deliberately using intense muscular sensation to ignore subtle, emotional, intuitive, and kind of values kind of sensation.
So what's the distinction there you make between embodiment and physical work?
Yeah, for me, one would be being aware of the body as an object, and the other one would be being aware as a body. And I also think there's a subtler layer to it. So, if I'm going to do some pull-ups after this. It's my lunchtime exercise, right? Like that'd be pretty muscular, pretty bodily. And if my biceps are really screaming, I'm not going to be aware. It's very hard to be aware of the subtle emotional sensation, which is maybe you need to get more rest or go spend some time with Daria, or, oh, that was interesting what Miles said. Maybe I should pursue that. Yeah. So I think the way we can use muscular to dissociate from the more subtle kind of.
Totally. So you're strengthening your interiors as well. You're strengthening your subjective experience as well as the objective.
Yeah, and like let's say I'm doing a push-up. Well, I can be doing that with my muscles, or I can actually be okay, how am I with firmness? How am I with holding stuff we've been talking about? How am I with holding structure and not giving up? How am I relaxing into pressure and not stopping breathing and going into a fight-flight response because my pectorals are tired, So even a press-up could be an embodied practice. Though I see that being in supportive, like your dojo is a place where it actually really shocked me. Your dojo is a place where it's great teachers, beautiful place, some amazing people, a great culture. And even there, you'll get people on the mat doing just physical Aikido.
Especially here. And look, it's something I've been pushing, and it's me pushing back against the culture for 10 years. And it's, the culture matters, man. Culture is a lot to work with.
But also you've created a culture, right? Like it's like if I go say there's a seminar Miles used to host called the Dead Sea Seminar with Patrick Cassidy, and you're there, and Chen's there, and Daniela's there, and all the beautiful, awesome people we train with, and within a very short space of time, you're doing the most transcendent Aikido.
Yeah.
Because of the culture of that place that's built, the intention people have come with. Do you want to say a little bit about that seminar? Because I know you don't do it now, but it was special to a lot of people. Like, what made it special?
Well, let's talk about states. My intention with the design of those seminars is actually to take people into. I find it easier, Mark, working with people to get people into a states. Yeah. Experience than to get them into a perspective experience.
Okay, state's kind of quick and easy. You just do something that.
Yeah, and somebody who's really rigid with their, let's say I'm left leaning, somebody who's like right wing Republican. We could have interesting conversations all day long. He just won't change his mind. Yeah, but we could both be in the same yoga space, Aikido space, meditation space, and both drop into a sense of oneness or deeper connection with the beauty of life. That's the state experience. Yeah. So those seminars were specifically designed to be state experiences for a few different reasons. But one of the reasons is because when you get because Palestinians were also coming to those. So when you get Israelis and Palestinians and international people together, you bring people into a state experience. All those differences, all those problems, all those conflicts disappear in the state experience.
Yeah, that's what we saw in Cyprus and in the Dead Sea, and the difficulty is stabilizing it afterwards, right? And then what do you do?
That's the challenge.
I remember you said this at the time in Cyprus. This was like 11, 12 years ago, I think. And I wasn't able to get it at the time. You're like, well, Mark, this has been a great state, but what happens next, And I was like, but we've changed everything. It's all, naively thinking this is it. We had this great experience of eating together and dancing and doing Aikido, and all these people that used to hate each other coming together. And it's like, okay, what happens next? Right. Yeah.
But see, that's what it's like for most people who fly in, and, those who are not working on the front line, they fly in, they get, and they have this beautiful experience that they're kind of making a better world. And for sure they are. For sure we are. But then going to the front line is like a whole nother story, because again, we're talking about culture. Culture fucking matters.
Yeah, it's huge, isn't it? It's huge, and it's one that I see denied a lot. I think in Europe, actually, it's sort of harder to deny because there's so many countries close together. You go across a border and they're speaking French and not Dutch, and then you go across another one and they're speaking German, and you've only driven for an hour across Switzerland, for example. Right. And it's like, wow, it's harder to ignore that in a way. I see more ignored in the States.
Well, here's So here's why I mentioned that, because, in the work that I'm doing, and I'm talking about my Aikido meditation, spiritual, whatever, and the work that you're doing, we're actually trying to move the needle on culture. We're actually trying to awaken people around a different view that, for our opinion, is actually more embodied, more holistic. It's bringing things together. And for that to actually, and we're doing that because we see it, there's a deep need in the world. And for that to happen, we have to be able to advocate and reach a certain amount of people. And you're doing an amazing job with your media stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to segue into sort of, as we kind of come towards the close here, to your online stuff, because it's one thing being in a tent overlooking the Dead Sea.
Right.
You have to fly in, which isn't environmentally sustainable, and it wasn't, I think, financially sustainable, the amount of energy it took. Mm-hmm. You know, we can be doing stuff online, and these podcasts, I'm hoping, will reach thousands of people. You know, my aim is
each month.
I know, that's what I would like. I would like to get 1 million downloads on these, you know, and it's, well, that's not unrealistic. My YouTube channel has 11 million hits. Now, even if only 1 in 10 of those were not trashy hits, you know, 1 in 10 of those are really genuinely watching a video.
Yeah.
Like some kid from rural East Anglia in England has reached 1 million people on YouTube. And that's astounding. Like, and there's also challenges with it, right? Like doing embodiment work online, to some people, I used to think that was a contradiction. I don't anymore. But you speak to that. How is it that you've segued and you've started doing things in the online space and your virtual dojo that you run?
Well, I mean, it's for sure. Look, the message is getting out there much more. You know, there's something I used to think that, you know, imagine there's 100. Let's just talk about Aikido. It could be yoga, embodiment, whatever. If there's 100 people in your space, in your city or wherever you're doing your job, teaching the same thing, you don't have to compete. Your view, especially if you want to kind of change the paradigm, or if you want to kind of lay down a perspective, you don't have to compete with 100 different perspectives. You just need to be in the top 10. The top 10 people out of 100 are the ones that they're deciding the context.
Yeah.
Your voice just needs to be among those 10. And that's where media is incredibly important and incredibly powerful. Now, hopefully we're using an ethical way for really making a better world. You are, for sure. That's what I hope to be doing myself. But, in one sense, I'm doing it because I see, in one sense, the Aikido world has kind of flattened out in a certain paradigm that needs to evolve. And I recently did a telesummit. We had close to 3,000 people join the telesummit.
Really? Was it 3,000? Wow.
Yeah.
Like, that's a fairly minority pursuit. But you can also micro niche, right? Like you did a course, meditation for Aikido teachers.
Exactly right. Yeah. And it was up to date. It was my most popular course, and it's something I'm going to repeat again in a few months. And it's it's been wildly popular. So the telesummit was great. We had 45 teachers, and it was I was the one that was setting the context. I was the host for the whole thing. And it was amazing. It was one of these love fests where we actually started to kind of shift. From my opinion, we started to move the needle on culture. And, media is fantastic for that. But it takes, just like, when we do whatever our embodiment practice is, we have our basic practices, but eventually maturity means your capacity to see into subtlety on one level, and your capacity to see into complexity on another level. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to move into culture, culture is damn complex. And we need to kind of push the needle on ourselves. We need to move the needle within ourselves to see into the complexity and the underpinnings of culture. And, media is helpful for that.
Mm. So let's have a look. What else? Anything else you want to talk about? I'm looking through a list of questions I've got here. We talked about sharing our gift throughout, haven't we? This idea that it's not enough to sit in the mountain. There's a sense of like, I want to get this out there, and using all these technologies to do that now seems like.
But what happens to us when we share our gifts? We wake up, we awaken. If you really hold it to yourself, or you're just, it kind of doesn't really. It's another dimension wakens up, and we become more alive as human beings when we share our gift.
Yeah, I think this is essential, like doing, even just as an intention, doing yoga for yourself and doing it for even just say your family, having that intention is different. And there's practical things like a bunch of people I'm training this year on EFC are starting the part of the course where they teach other people. And in that, they deepen their own understanding tremendously. And then on this sort of deeper spiritual level, it doesn't quite cut it unless you're sharing it with social animals. That is just key. And I actually feel like we're so lucky, even though like the world desperately needs embodiment, this disembodied world and technologies, this weird paradox, right? That on the one hand, technology is a part of the disembodiment. Yeah. But sitting in front of a computer all day, not feeling your body, not moving. But on the other hand, how lucky are we that we can be talking now thousands of miles apart. You know, my peer network is all around the world. I'm doing something with you on Saturday, right, as well. You've got a course that I'm on Saturday.
That's right.
Yeah. We're sharing on the podcast. We're sharing on Facebook every day. And it's like, on the one hand, we're incredibly lucky how we can bring our stuff into the world without huge resources. Like, we don't need to be a sort of media baron, or like, neither of us are techie people, right? Now, you might have someone that helps us out a bit, but we're not really techie people.
Yeah. If you can do Skype, you can connect. And we find our tribe that way. And, you know, in being in a position where you're actually advocating a perspective, your tribe is going to gather around you, and you've got a gift to give there. And, you know, I encourage everybody to give that as much as possible. Maybe it can be too much for sure, but, you know, it's a big deal. It really is a big deal.
Nice. Okay, that might be a place to start wrapping it up. Anything else you want to talk about before we go to where people can find out more about you?
Just that it's always, yeah. You know, in one sense, Mark, we always have to take a leap of faith. You know, I don't mean that in a religious sense, although of course it's that as well, but, you know, or in a spiritual sense. But, you know, we're always going to face our challenges, you know, when we really start to kind of bring awareness into whatever we're doing. And, I mean, look at you. Look how much you've done. Look what you know. Look where you've gone in 10 years or however many years you've been kind of building your work and your community. Each and every step was a leap of faith. Was a risk, and you know, you saw potential and you went for it. And you know, that's where you and I connect. I mean, we're both kind of Enneagram 7s. You're 7, right?
Sure, 7/8. Yeah.
So it's kind of easy for us to kind of jump off the cliff and then build an airplane on the way down. And my experience is sometimes we hit the ground, sometimes we crash. It doesn't work. But more times than not, we fly. And that's something I would encourage everybody to do.
Nice. That's a beautiful place to end there, Miles. I want to encourage people to check you out. Miles' Aikido dojos, I regard it as potentially the best Aikido dojo in the world, having experimented and tried many of them. That's a researched opinion. The best for growing as a person in a mature context, let me put it a bit more specifically. So if anyone's in Tel Aviv, people can still come and train with you and stay with you, right? You still do like that live-in.
We still have Uchideshi live-in students. Yeah.
Germany and all sorts come to train with you, don't they? Yeah. So that I would recommend that to any Aikido people. Non-Aikido people, they can find you online, your centering course, or what can they find?
Well, theintegraldojo.com is my blog. There's stuff about Aikido, meditation, etc. there. I did put together a centering course. It's a series of videos that I've had for a while, but I kind of packaged them together for everybody that's listening to this podcast. You can go there, and these are specific Aikido exercises, but they actually apply to every aspect of your life, whether you do Aikido or not. It's about really getting into the center. If you want to connect more with people, just practice centering. They're cool exercises. It's at theintegraldojo.com/centering. It's there for free. Enjoy.
And can you send us all the links, and then we'll make sure that Aggie uploads those on when it's uploaded online. So send me the exact links that you want, as many as you like, and we'll.
I'll do that. And for those listening, integraldojo.com theintegraldojo.com/centering. It's pretty simple.
Embodiment Geeks, thanks for listening. It's been a real pleasure to have you on, Miles. To say to everyone out there, there's going to be more great interviews coming up, so subscribe if you haven't already, and find us on the Facebook page as well. We can discuss some of the ideas. I'll tag Miles to when his video and podcast are up, so you can actually ask him questions as well. So everyone, thank you for listening. Miles, thank you so much for coming on today.
It's always a joy and pleasure to explore with you, Mark.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.